For more on the political and legal impact of the ruling in Colorado, David Becker rejoins us, along with Major Garrett. He's our chief Washington correspondent. Gentlemen, it's great to have you both here, especially on this day-to-day. David, I want to start with you. You touched on it briefly, but can you explain exactly what this decision means and how big of a deal is it?
Yeah, you had it right, Gayle, when you said this was stunning, but there is legal basis for this. The 14th Amendment exists for a reason, and the 14th Amendment says that someone who is an officer of the United States and who has taken an oath and who then engages in insurrection can't hold office as an officer of the United States. And these kinds of cases have been brought with regard to Donald Trump in many states all over the country, and up until now, every state has dismissed these cases on procedural grounds. They've said the Republican Party has a lot of leeway to decide who its nominee is, and so we're not going to inject ourselves at this moment. But Colorado is the first state where they found both that now the Supreme Court has found that he is an officer of the United States, the presidency is an office of the United States, and that he engaged in insurrection, and therefore, under the 14th Amendment, he's disqualified.
So, David, let me ask you this. The Supreme Court will likely rule on this. Is this a shortcut way to get the Supreme Court to rule on whether or not Donald Trump did, in fact, incite an insurrection?
I don't know if the Supreme Court of Colorado intended it as a shortcut, but that's how it's going to play out. And that's actually probably a good thing. It's important for a lot of people in the United States to know whether or not Donald Trump is a qualified candidate for the presidency. It's important to the Republican Party. They need to know if they have a qualified nominee. It's important to election officials who are printing ballots with candidates' names on them. And it's, of course, important to the voters who ultimately have to decide who they're going to vote for, who they can vote for. So it's good that the Supreme Court is going to take this up and hopefully rule on it quickly.
Major, do you think this ruling will impact Donald Trump's campaign? It was interesting. He made no mention of the ruling yesterday on the campaign trail.
He doesn't have to, Gayle. He knows that this will create tremendous press attention. He knows, and this was predictable, and it happened, all the Republicans challenging him for the party's nomination rallied, if not to his defense, but to say something that they believe is a commonsensical proposition in this country, that courts shouldn't decide who's on the ballot. But that's not really the question. The question is, what does the Constitution say about your qualifications if you were president of the United States and were an active, if not active participant, a non-benign actor in an attack on the Capitol to prevent the peaceful transfer of power? That's the question the court was asked. The court didn't jump into this. The court was asked a central constitutional question, only asked in our entire history because of the actions of former President Trump. That's a moral question that will be adjudicated politically by the Republican Party, and for the moment, it will give Trump not only a lot of press attention, which he benefits from, but a rallying effect within the party itself. Long term, though, I'm not so sure it will be a net positive.
Yeah, do you guys see any scenario where he could be removed from the general election?
I do not.
I think, it's hard to predict exactly what the Supreme Court will rule. If they agree with the Colorado Supreme Court that he is an officer of the United States and that he engaged in insurrection, and there certainly is evidence that would justify such a ruling, then he could be kept off of the general election ballot. And it's important for the Republican Party to know that as soon as possible so they can select a qualified nominee who could ascend to the presidency if they want.
But the issue for the Supreme Court, I think, David would agree with me on this, is did candidate Trump receive due process on the question of being an insurrectionist? And the Supreme Court could say, no, he hasn't been convicted of that. He hasn't had due process to answer that question. Of course, the Trump legal team is trying to delay any adjudication of that very question here in the federal court in D.C. But the Supreme Court could say, this is an open question about the conduct of Trump, and therefore he can't be removed from a ballot because we don't have a legally adjudicated answer to that insurrectionist question.
A lot of what ifs there, to be continued for sure. David Becker and Major Garrett, thank you for joining us this morning.